So this topic is mechanisms of evolution, and this is actually a pretty long slide presentation. I'm going to try to keep it brief, which just by length of slides is kind of difficult. So without preamble, here we go. Evolution always makes everyone think of Darwin and his idea, his book of Origin of Species. And he was not the first one to think of this. He was actually not alone. He was kind of racing to publish against another scientist. Actually, we'll talk about it a little bit. But oh, I don't know, it's about racing. He postponed. He did not publish his book when he first wrote it. He held it off for years. His wife asked him to because she knew the controversy that it would cause, and she didn't want to be ostracized in their community by their friends and neighbors because they published something. He had published something controversial. So, but when he found that another scientist had come to similar conclusions from different sources and was going to publish, he went ahead and published at that time as well. So anyway, but prior to both those scientists, the other one is oh, Wallace. Um, the early Greek philosopher Anaximander, okay, who predates Aristotle, had this idea that simpler forms preceded a more complex form simply because that's what he thought he observed in the rocks, in fossils. Um, Aristotle and Anaximander didn't exactly get along. Well, I think their lifespan overlapped each other a little bit. I'm not sure. I'd have to go look that up. Aristotle lived in the 300 BC time period, like 300, 350 BC. He was actually Alexander the Great's tutor, at least for a point in time there. And because Alexander the Great was so revered for so long after he died, then his teacher, of course, was also revered, and his writings were preserved, whereas others were somewhat lost or, forgotten, to be found later. But in some cases, we've lost a lot of that knowledge too, just over time, and people not caring for it and just destroying it because they didn't value it. But uh, there were other things where Aristotle didn't agree with Anaximander's ideas and therefore set about to replace them to some extent. So I don't know if he just took the opposite viewpoint or a different viewpoint from Anaximander on this, or if this is how he really, 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 really viewed the world based on what he saw as evidence, or if he was just saying, well, we're going to be different. I don't know. But Aristotle said species are fixed and do not evolve. And of course, this had a great impact on Western thinking, what we call Western thinking, European science for, 1,300 years or so. Okay. Well over 1,000 for sure, because it fit well with the Judeo-Christian biblical view. And so in 325 AD, the Emperor Constantine held the Council of Nicaea, where the foundations of Christian doctrine were established, and what it was decided what was church belief and what wasn't church belief, because things had gotten a little murky, and you had people with different viewpoints and all claiming to be Christians. So the church said, we're going to codify it, and they did. And there were I think there were several councils of Nicaea. Um, so uh, throughout those, things were thrown out of the church and things were left in or brought in. Aristotle was accepted, okay, as a science reference. Okay, so it impacted Western thinking in that if you went against the ideas of the church in your science research and thinking, then you had to pay consequences. Okay, you had to think about whether you wanted to be imprisoned for what you were saying, or you might just be forced to recant, which is what kind of happened with Galileo. He also was imprisoned and stayed in prison. Uh, but I think it was at first he was forced. He was asked, and maybe he refused. I was thinking he retracted and then he republished again or something like that. I've kind of forgotten those stories. But anyway, you could be asked or told. You had to say what you said wasn't right. You realized the error of your ways. Or you could go to prison, or you could be excommunicated, or you could be put to death, depending on where you were and what your political standing was to some extent. Okay, where you lived and the situation. Okay, of the time. So yeah, a lot of ideas of science the scientists came up with were set aside or disregarded because it was dangerous to think that way for 1,000 years or so. 1300, I think, really, if you start looking at Aristotle being in the 300s, and he influenced from his lifetime on greatly. But it was very much codified there around the 300 AD time period. So it's not until 1700, in the century prior to Darwin, that we start to see some things being published in the Age of Enlightenment. After religious reformations have occurred, you've got a lot of breaking away from the one authoritarian doctrine, and the not that some of the breakaways weren't authoritarian and still aren't, but there was room for some disagreement now all of a sudden, without necessarily having to be put to death or excommunicated or put in prison or whatever. So we have Buffon, who is French, and Lamarck also is French. They studied fossils and separately, and of course the standard doctrine, biblical doctrine idea, was that the Earth was 6,000 years old. And I've done that exercise. I did it actually on my own as a teenager. If you go in and you start adding up all of the years of the begats and the this and the that, and how many generations, and taking 25 as an average generation, which is what geneticists use, and from the carrying away of Babylon, from the flood to the carrying away of Babylon, and from the carrying away of Babylon to all these different states that there are things they talk about in the Bible. There, you can come up with a number of years, okay, until Jesus was born, and then that's supposed to split history, split human history. There'll be as many human history years after Jesus as there was before Jesus. So, how many however many years in history there was before, that we can predict when the end's going to happen. See, and so at the time they were saying that the Earth was about 6,000 years old. It was about 1,700 years since the birth of Jesus, and therefore, oh, I don't do the math. What is that? 4,300 years old prior. That's when, yeah, Adam and Eve had to happen, and the whole Earth was formed and all that. And so, a total of 6,000 years, and that was the fossils didn't support that idea. Fossils were saying this Earth's been around here a lot longer than that. And then Lamarck says that, and also these fossils, if we look at them, we can see that earlier life forms are a little different than what we see today, but we can see how what is around today is similar to those that may have come out of them. And of course, you've kind of seen that with your foraminiferans in our the day the Mesozoic died film exercises, the little lab that went along with that, where you looked at the foraminiferans and the change that occurred in them. But some survived. It's just the smaller ones were able to survive after the change in conditions of the asteroid or whatever it was that killed the dinosaurs. Okay, so Darwin sailed in this ship, and there's a whole story about how he got onto that ship and stuff, and I often tell that in class, but I won't. I'm trying to keep this shorter as much as possible. Okay, so I want to let you read some of these slides on your own here. The main thing here is I want to point out Lyell. Lyell is a geologist, again, who wrote a book called Principles of Geology, and that was a book that was studied by scientists at that time. And you got to understand, in the 1800s, you did not have, oh, I'm a biologist, I'm a chemist, I'm a physicist, there were people who might have been a little bit more into one of those than the other, but you were a naturalist or a natural scientist, scientist, a philosopher of nature. Okay, it was really more the title, and you studied it all. It was all interconnected. It is all interconnected, and our knowledge was at the point where you couldn't know everything about all the subjects, but you could know everything that there was to know at that time, okay, about several different subjects. Okay, so people did, and they were well versed in different areas. So many of your science types would have read Principles of Geology by Lyell. It was, like I said, very well read book by the scientists, science thinking people of that time. And that gets us into the idea of plate tectonics and the fact that the Earth is changing constantly. There's these forces that cause it to move and shift. Okay, it's not stagnant. Okay, so go on at some pictures. This is, you can look at this map and you can see the course of the trip and all the different places that the Beagle stopped at. And of course, the Galapagos Islands are right here. And this little map blows them up. Okay. they wouldn't have stayed there that long. They didn't really go around to study that, I don't think. If I remember the story correctly, the ship actually um, broke broke down kind of there. I think a mast broke, and they had to go find a tree and harvest a tree and rebuild the mast, and it took some time. Okay. Uh, so anyway, you can read all about that somewhere else. But he took his time while he was there and turned it to his advantage and studied everything he could get his hands on, which was his whole point of going on the voyage anyway, was to catalog and describe everything that he saw. Okay. So Alfred Russel Wallace also had the same idea, very very similar idea to Darwin's, and he came about his in a different way. And yeah, I've read a book about him, and there's several different books about him you can read. The reason you don't know about him, okay, is that Darwin's book on Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection was written for the common person. Now, if you read it, you may go, that language isn't very understandable common language to me. But in the 1850s, that's how people spoke. They had a much larger vocabulary than we do today. And they used these large words that had nuances to the meaning. And you say, well, why didn't they just say this? And it's simpler. It's like, well, yeah, but that word means just a little bit more, or it has a little difference to it. Okay. And so that's why your 19th century literature is so rich in language and difficult to understand if you're not used to those vocabulary words, is because the people spoke in nuances and the writers wrote in those nuances, and it's really kind of neat, okay, to read it. So if you've been bored with that stuff because you had trouble understanding it, well, that's why. And I challenge you to kind of branch out a little bit, get a dictionary or look things up on your phone and go read it, because it adds so much color to what you're reading. So Darwin wrote it to be understandable by the non-science person. And Alfred Russel Wallace wrote his as a scientist for scientists. Okay, he was writing as a for the scientific community only. He didn't care if his book sat around on people's coffee tables and was the talk of the tea parties and other parties that people had in their houses in those days, because they didn't have TV and movies and all that. It was live theater or cards and dancing over at somebody else's house. So he wasn't after that. Darwin was, kind of. All right, that was just the style of writing he took as opposed to what Wallace took. So Wallace's work, actually, if you study evolution and the subsequent people who researched and followed it, Wallace's work is quoted much more often and cited much more often in these papers than Darwin's work, okay, because his work was actually more scientific, right? And that is one reason also why Darwin can get so attacked by people clear up to today about how, well, that doesn't hold water and this isn't right and that is this and this and this. And it's like, well, because he didn't write it in a scientific manner exactly, and he didn't exactly support it as much scientifically as maybe he could have, and Wallace did, but nobody knows about Wallace. So if you think, well, Darwin didn't know what he's talking about, well, he wasn't the only one talking about it, and other people did have um, support for the same idea. Okay. So Darwin had this idea of descent with modification, and I'll let you read all that. You've probably seen and heard it before. I've kind of summarized a lot of this stuff. We've talked a little bit about it. Um, and his idea of natural selection was that organisms that produce more offspring that can survive, well, then can survive in an environment, the weak will get killed by predators and things, and not being able to compete as well for food as the better competitors. So say, I hate to use the strong and the weak, because sometimes they may be weak in one genetic way and strong in another, and that gives them an advantage to survive. But that weak manner may not necessarily be desirable in another situation, but it gets them to survive in this situation. So you say survival of the fittest. Well, fit for what? Okay, fit at that moment, maybe not fit for somewhere else though, maybe not fit for a change or a different location. So that's a misleading term to some extent. But for that environment, those that can survive to pass those traits on will, and those traits will become prevalent in that area. Um, So this unequal ability of individuals to survive leads to gradual change in populations over time, is the idea, and that's natural selection is supported by evidence from artificial selection. Again, back to the Cosmos film and some other things we talked about, is that we humans, we breed for traits. And if we can do it, we're not creating anything that nature hasn't already done. We're just imitating nature, copying nature, speeding it up because we're putting a greater selective pressure on it even than nature does. Okay, so here's some examples of what we humans have done. Okay, on your left over here, you have mustard plant. And from that wild mustard plant, we have bred these vegetables over here. You've got red cabbage, kale, cauliflower, broccoli, and Brussels sprouts. And there's more. That's not the limit of it. Christina, where's green cabbage? Well, okay, it could be there. Um, all of that out of this plant, choosing for curly leaves, bigger flowers, and a tighter head. These are flowers. These are actually the florets. They haven't bloomed out yet. Okay. Broccoli florets will bloom out. So you're eating the flower, eating the embryo flower okay, when you eat broccoli. Um, yeah, so this is all what we have done in just a few hundred years of selective breeding. Um, and as Sagan said, in a few thousand years, um, what can Mother Nature do? Uh, the wolf, okay, and relatives of the wolf, okay, as you can see there. And then, of course, we domesticated some ancestor here of wolf and have bred all of our current canines out of that domestication. I think about how many dogs. I mean, there's the Great Dane, the Irish Wolfhound. Those are two huge dogs, and then you've got teacup poodles. I mean, chihuahuas. Yeah, I mean, just and everything in between. So that's just what targeted breeding over a few thousand years there. Okay, will do. Fossils, I will not read over this with you. We've talked enough about fossils in that lab. You can reread this, view it. Okay, that's I think Australopithecus. Okay, early human ancestor. Uh, Petrified wood, some brachiopods, I think. Anyway, very small. These are pencil leads. If you want to get the idea of what that's pencil lead. Okay, so trying to show you the size of that. Early fossils. Dinosaur footprints. Okay, looks like that's cracked. It looks like that's mud, just dried mud, but that's actually rock. And the where the dinosaurs sank into the mud walking. Okay, that's a child, not an adult standing in it, but still, it's pretty deep. Leaf fossil. And of course, Jurassic Park. No, uh, insects are actually preserved in amber. That is a true thing. And the idea that we could extract the DNA out of amber is not impossible. This insect here is preserved intact. Possibly could um, get DNA out of that and compare. In fact, I think I've read where that has been done with different insects. They compare the ancestral insects to the modern day insect DNA to see how much has changed evolutionarily. Um, what gene sequences are different and what's the same. Um, in some cases, with the plants in particular, they found that genome hasn't changed a whole lot. It's we think the atmosphere that's changed that causes the plants to not grow as big as they were, and like ferns and stuff. Now, other things have changed a lot because some things that exist now didn't exist at all in history. So they had to evolve out of things that did exist. So that's a bit of change there. But we're looking at something that existed in a larger form back then and is a similar, smaller form now. Sometimes that's just environmental differences, not letting certain genes be expressed, it seems. This is Ötzi. He was a prehistoric man found frozen in the Alps. Well, he wasn't actually found frozen because with the Earth getting warmer, we've had lots and lots of ice melt going on all around the planet. And so he was discovered about 10 or 15 years ago, I think. It's been a while. It's been 10, I'm sure, in the Alps. And uh, he's been studied. We know what his last three meals were by the residue remnants left in his stomach and intestines. They could tell a lot about his life, just doing all sorts of studies on his body. Uh, and he's not the only thing that's given us information about the past. Okay, with the ice melting, we've had a baby woolly mammoth uncovered in almost purely intact. The whole thing was completely intact. Its tail was even there until the sled, they parked the sled they brought it in on outside of a trading post to go in and make a call to some scientists that they'd found it. And some village dogs came along and dragged, grabbed hold of the tail and pulled it off. So that's how well preserved it was. The dogs wanted to chew on it. Of course, now they'll chew on about anything, but I mean, you know, it was still flexible, okay, from what I read. So we've been able to, scientists have been able to, from that, pull out DNA and map the DNA of the woolly mammoth. And the only thing standing between us and actually cloning that and bringing a woolly mammoth back to life is finding a suitable egg for it. The closest living relative to the woolly mammoth is a particular type of, I believe, Asian elephant, and that one is on the extinction list. And they would have to take a female. With our current technology, the only way we know how to do this is to take a female and flush all of her eggs out of her, and then use those eggs to, to try to get a clone. And it's like we can't just take some. It would prevent her from ever reproducing an offspring. And with the elephants at the level of near extinction that they're at, we don't want to lose even one female out of that population. So that's, last I read, the big holdup. And then of course there's the ethical question of, should we bring a mammoth back from extinction? Yeah, okay. So Grand Canyon, of course, these, you see the layers there. Look at those layers. There's fossils in those layers. That this is the history of the planet down to a certain point. They're just exposed, and geologists and scientists of all sorts do go and study those layers and the things found in those layers. Comparative anatomy here is this. This is a vestigial leg, hind leg, left in or found in this fossil of something that they think it, even back in that point, at one point it had been on land walking and it went back into the water, possibly for survival, or its ancestor did, because at this point it's still not, it's not really functioning as a leg anymore. It's just a fin, okay, but it's got all the bones in it for a leg, okay. So we'll talk briefly about that. Biogeography, you can read that. So comparative anatomy, this was something that before DNA mapping, we really used to determine closeness of relationships between organisms. So we looked for what's called homologous features. This is an example of homologous features. We've got, just look at the bones. You get, this is a human arm, of course, cat leg, whale fin, and bat wing. Okay, look at the bone structures. You've got long bone, long bone. Well, this is a short bone, but still one bone, and in here one bone. Okay, then we've got these two bones, two, again, short bones, but two and two bones. And then you wind up with the, is it, these are the tarsals, right? Tarsals. My anatomy is weak because I was not, I memorized all the stuff I had to and regurgitated on a test, but I was not fond of anatomy, so I didn't retain much of it. Okay, I've had to relearn some of it as I've gotten older, but okay, tarsals, metatarsals, okay, one or the other, both of those. All right, and so your finger bones, toe bones, whatever you would call wing bones, but look, they're all similar. So we say these had to all have a common ancestor because of the structural similarities that we see here. And in fact, these are all mammals. Vestigial structures are things, or remnants of structures that once served important structures or functions in an organism's ancestors, but are no longer needed by the ancestor today. So something that people talk about is like they say, well, a vestigial organ is our appendix, but now we're finding that, well, maybe it's not vestigial because it does seem to have some type of immune function. And yeah, I don't know, we're kind of cautious about that now. So maybe we just don't understand it completely. So try to be a little more cautious about saying like that. But we have a tailbone. We all have a tailbone. You probably bruised it at some point in your life. And I'll say, well, that's not necessary. We don't have a tail anymore. We lost our tail. Okay, so the tailbone is just the vestigial remnants of that. How far back do we lose our tail? I don't know. Okay, none of us great apes have tails. Okay, we talked about that in the Telltale Telomere Lab. The chimpanzee, our closest relative, doesn't have tail. I didn't talk about the tail fact, but they are our closest relative. I showed you the genome maps to support that, and the inverted telomere for the second chromosome. But the some of the monkeys do. Okay, so I have to possibly go pretty far back in our ancestry tree to find a tail, and I don't know how accurate it is. I know the tail helps other things balance, but those are things that walk on all fours. When you get to walking upright, which our great ape cousins do at least part of the time walk upright. Okay, they may also use their hands on the ground to balance and do this and that. They are a little bit more, um, I don't know, flexible and agile than we are, maybe in that aspect of uh, doing that. But um, they do walk upright, have ability to walk upright to some extent, and they don't have tails. Okay, so there's a thought that losing the tail may actually aid in the balancing of walking upright. But I will also say that I've read where the tailbone helps us walk. There's the little bit that we've got of a tail left does help us balance while we walk, supposedly. Okay, and I've only read that in one article, and it may have been shown to not be supported by other scientists in another article. I don't know, but what was being cited there was some evidence that people who sustained serious injury to their tailbone where it was crushed beyond um, recovery. Basically, the bones had to be removed, or it had gotten some type of like bone cancer disease on that those fused vertebrae down at the bottom there that form that's called the coccyx, and they had to have those bones removed for some reason. Had to learn to walk again. Okay, because of the change in balance that they experienced. Not that they couldn't walk without it. It's just it took a whole new training of how to walk without that balancing feature. So anyway, thought that was interesting. So I digress though, and I need to move forward fast. Also, okay, so here we're looking at homologous structures of adults of these mammals. Okay, we can look at other animals too. And another thing we look at is embryological development. Okay, comparative embryology. So here on the left, you've got a chick embryo, and here you have a human embryo, and you can also pull out a little like a tadpole embryo and look at it, and you'll see things that are very similar. Okay, chicken is not a mammal. Chicken is an Aves class, and I mentioned a tadpole. Well, that's going to be a different class altogether as mammals. So yeah, I don't have the picture up here, so I won't go dwell on it. But notice how similar we look, and there's a little tail. Here's our little tail. Okay, we have pharyngeal pouches. Okay, and fish have pharyngeal pouches. All right, fish again are another class altogether. We'll get into classes with animals here shortly. So different lecture, but yeah, the animal kingdom. So we have pharyngeal pouches, and for us, they develop into our tonsils, our thyroid glands, different glands in there. For fish, that's what become the gills. Okay, but we all have this at the same point of our development. Okay, and then we start to differentiate. So we look at this and say we all form from an egg and a sperm that unite. And as our embryos form, they look very similar. They have some of the same features. It's just they start to differentiate as different sets of genes start kicking in and producing proteins that cause things to go down a different path. And then, of course, we look at DNA. And I've already done a lab with you on that, so I won't go into that much more. But here's an example of we talked about amino acids. I think we talked about albumin in that lab, albumin production. But here's the percent of amino acids are identical in the human hemoglobin to other animal hemoglobin that you find. Okay, so you kind of see where we're closely related and not so closely related. So some interesting ways of looking at natural selection, though, is what's going to survive here is the insect that blends in the best is going to survive predators. So appears like, can you find the insect there? This is it right here. Okay, I think it's even its legs, I think, are flower-like looking. And this one's more visible. You can see the uh, back of it here, the carapace. Yeah, yeah. Um, and leg there. These are wings out over the abdomen area. Okay. So genetic resistance to pesticides. The idea here is that, if you expose a population to continuous chemical exposure that kills them, kills them, kills them, kills them, there's going to be some percentage represented by one here, but you understand it's not just one, it's going to be a few, but it's a percentage of the population. So this would be saying it's like, oh, well, 1 out of 5, 20%, 1/5 of the population will have a gene sequence, some difference, maybe a mutation, maybe just a difference that not a recent mutation even, but some difference that allows them, that's been in that population for a while, it allows them to survive this this selection pressure, and they will reproduce because the others die. So they'll reproduce with each other, and then that means that um, most, if not all, of their offspring will have that same genetic sequence. It doesn't have to be all of them, because if that is not a recessive trait, okay, if it's like a codominant or incomplete dominance trait, then some of the offspring may not get it. Um, can't can't exactly be a dominant trait. Okay. Um, well, I guess it could be. Some dominant traits can be very low percentage population. Usually expected as 75% of the population will be dominant, 25% um, recessive. And if it's a dominant trait, nobody's going to develop a spray that kills off only 25% of the population. They're going to go after something else, more effective than that. So, um, you know, it's unlikely that it's an actual dominant trait, recessive or codominant, complete, whatever type of thing. If it's not purely recessive, then you can wind up with offspring that don't have it. Okay, so the next population may be mixed, but then continued spraying will even weed those out. And so what you eventually get is a selection for things where almost all, if not all, of the surviving population is resistant, not immune. Okay, this is not an immune thing. Students will want to put that on test. It's immunity. It gets an immunity to it. It does not. Okay, they have a resistance to it. Okay. Usually, what happens is, well, from the cases that I've studied when I had to study, like, herbicide physiology, pesticide physiology in plants, was that the mutation will allow them to metabolize the poison into something that doesn't harm them. Okay, or they can recognize it, package it, and slough it off as a waste product without letting it get into the system somehow. There's a mechanism that's different in their metabolism uh, from the others in the population. At least that's one of the methods that I remember studying about for this resistance. Okay, um, you can read that. Population, these are definitions, so just study those definitions. And wait, I may want to stop here. Yeah, I want to stop here. I don't want to go into Hardy Weinberg. I want to give you a break. Go think about something else for a while and come back and watch the next episode. Okay, I'll talk to you then.